Hello and welcome to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting to discuss the channel conveyance improvements for Clawson Ditch project. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Flood Control District to share vital information with the community. My name is Robert Fricke and I am with the Flood Control team. I am joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we continue to keep you up to date on these important flood mitigation projects in your community. We are also joined by staff from area elected officials' offices and community associations. We are glad to see all the communities so engaged in these projects. We look forward to continuing to share updates and keeping you all in the community informed. This virtual public meeting will begin with a presentation to share project updates, including discussing the potential plans, the project timeline, and next steps for flood reduction along the Q122-00-00 tributary, which we will be referring to as Clawson Ditch. The presentation will be followed by a virtual question and answer session with Flood Control District team members. Attendees will be able to submit comments and questions through the website or by phone. Any comments not addressed during the Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the event. Instructions on how to participate in the virtual open house are included on this slide, on this virtual meeting webpage, and on the Flood Control District's website. I will also share a reminder of these instructions when we reach the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be placed on the Flood Control District's YouTube channel in the next few days. All meeting materials will be available for download on the Flood Control District's website. We will now transition to Andrew Moore, Cedar Bayou Bond Implementation Program Technical Advisor with the Flood Control District, who will share more information about the Flood Control District and this project. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Robert, and a special thanks to each of you for joining us tonight. In this presentation, we will give a brief overview of this project. Before we get to the project specifics, we want to share some information about the Flood Control District. The Harris County Flood Control District is a special purpose district created by the Texas legislature in 1937 in response to devastating floods in 1929 and 1935. The Flood Control District was created to serve as a local partner to leverage federal funding for flood damage reduction projects. Our mission has greatly expanded over the past 80 years, with billions of dollars in infrastructure improvements in the ground. While we are a separate entity from Harris County, the Harris County Commissioners Court serves as our governing body. The mission of the Flood Control District is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. One of the most difficult challenges we face is constructing effective projects that are sensitive to community and natural values in a highly urbanized area. Harris County includes 23 main watersheds, totaling approximately 1,800 square miles, and more than 2,500 linear miles of channels. That is approximately the distance from New York to California. Each watershed has its own unique characteristics and needs. Tonight, we're talking about a project in the Cedar Bayou watershed of East Harris County, specifically improvements to the tributary Q122 subwatershed, otherwise known as Clawson Ditch. So why is Harris County prone to flooding? Some of the reasons are the county is prone to extreme rainfall, including tropical storms and hurricanes. We have a flat, slow draining landscape, and we have clay soils that do not soak up excess rainfall quickly. These flooding issues become more apparent when combined with dense population centers and development that has occurred in our region. While the Flood Control District plays a critical role in flood risk reduction, we are one of several entities involved in these efforts in our region. When rain falls on your roof, it flows through several jurisdictions, such as streets and drains maintained by the Harris County Engineering Department, a municipality utility district, or a city, such as the City of Houston, before it flows into a larger channel, creek or bayou, that the Flood Control District owns and maintains. This slide illustrates the various jurisdictions, which sometimes we even share with other entities. Inside neighborhoods, as shown on the left side of this illustration, storm sewers and roadside ditches collect stormwater runoff and start the process of moving it away from streets and homes. Storm sewers and roadside ditches are the responsibility of the underlying municipality. The larger bayous and channels that take the collected stormwater and move it through our drainage system to Galveston Bay are the responsibility of the Flood Control District. This is shown on the right side of the illustration. In the middle is a stormwater detention basin, sometimes constructed by the Flood Control District. When storm sewers on the left are increased, this creates an increase in runoff. Since it is our policy to avoid any adverse impacts from our projects, detention basins help to safely take in and temporarily store excess stormwater during heavy rain events. Often we partner with Harris County precincts, utility districts, and others to add recreational amenities such as trails to these basins and along our channels. On August 25th, 2018, Harris County voters approved $2.5 billion in bonds for flood risk reduction projects. This vote followed a series of meetings across Harris County in each watershed, which resulted in a list of what is now 181 bond projects. As of August 25th, 2021, every project included in the 2018 bond program has been initiated, including 8 projects in the Cedar Bayou watershed. A total of more than $1.35 billion in partnership funding has been secured so far to stretch the 2018 bond program even farther. The actual timing of each project will depend on a variety of factors, including environmental permitting, right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation, and in some cases, requirements of a particular grant. That said, project lists and projected schedules are updated frequently on our website. While the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project in the bond is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects in the bond program. As I mentioned before, we have had some success so far, having secured more than $1.35 billion in partner funds. And this graphic illustrates the many sources of these partnerships, including federal, state, and local funding that the Flood Control District is working to secure for Harris County. Each agency has its own definition of eligible projects and its own requirements for local match funding. So the Flood Control District works diligently to match projects to the right partnership opportunities. With that in mind, let's move to the part of the program that is specifically about the channel conveyance improvements for the Clawson Ditch project. Here we have a map of the Cedar Bayou watershed. The watershed is defined as all of the area that contributes drainage to the main channel, which in this case is Cedar Bayou. The Cedar Bayou watershed is the easternmost watershed in Harris County, and Cedar Bayou generally serves as the border for Harris County with Chambers and Liberty counties. The city of Baytown and areas such as Crosby and Huffman are located within the watershed, which encompasses nearly 200 square miles. Cedar Bayou flows in a southward direction from its headwaters in Liberty County to its mouth at Galveston Bay. There are about 128 miles of open streams within the watershed, including the primary stream and tributary channels. The main stem of Cedar Bayou is approximately 40 stream miles in length and directly impacts Harris County, Chambers County, and Liberty County. Before we get into the details of this project, I want to take a few minutes to share some background information. In 2018, the Flood Control District completed the Cedar Bayou Flood Risk Reduction Study. This planning study investigated the existing flood risk within the watershed and identified potential future drainage improvements aimed at mitigating these flood risks. Out of this study, Q122-00-00 tributary, also known as Clawson Ditch, was identified as a priority subwatershed and selected to be included in the 2018 bond program. Clawson Ditch is located in the midsection of the Cedar Bayou watershed. Looking at the inset on the left shows the limits of the Clawson Ditch subwatershed. Clawson Ditch sits just west of the Cedar Bayou main stem and is located between its confluence with Cedar Bayou and its upper limit just east of Soralla Road and south of FN 1942. Which is a major thoroughfare for the area, running southeast, bisecting this watershed. The Clawson Ditch subwatershed is approximately 8 square miles in area, with 9.5 miles of drainage channels conveying stormwater into Cedar Bayou. The project that we are discussing this evening focuses on drainage improvements along Clawson Ditch. This area is shown within the red box. As with much of our region, the subwatershed has a history of storm events that produce heavy rains and cause frequent flooding. This brings us to where we are today in the channel conveyance improvements at the Clawson Ditch project. This illustration represents the typical life cycle of a flood control district flood reduction project. The flood risk reduction study was the first stage of the project life cycle. Currently, we are finalizing the preliminary engineering stage, or PER. After completion of the PER, we will move into right-of-way acquisition and design stages of the project life cycle. Completion of these stages will lead us into construction and ultimately to the operation and maintenance of these implemented improvements. The purpose of the PER stage is to focus on identifying and evaluating possible alternatives to reduce flood risk within the Clawson Ditch project area. There are several criteria in mind as we evaluate possible alternatives, with the most important being hydraulic and drainage benefits provided to the project area, such as reducing flood risk and mitigating for any increase in flow downstream. The objective of the PER stage is to perform a detailed analysis of potential channel conveyance and stormwater detention alternatives within the area, to identify right-of-way necessary to facilitate project implementation and maintenance, and to identify and minimize project constraints such as utility relocations and environmental impacts. At the end of this stage, a preliminary engineering report, or PER, will be prepared that provides a recommendation that will move into design and construction. Before we get into the details of the project, I want to take a few minutes to cover some of the terms we will be using. Some of these you may have heard, but I think it will be beneficial to clarify some of the terminology. Throughout the presentation, we will be using terms like the 100-year, 10-year, and etc. A 1% annual chance event is a 100-year event, meaning that there is a rainfall event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. That does not mean that if you have a 1% chance event today, you are safe for another 100 years. It is simply a measure of the expected frequency based on the historical data that we have. By the same token, a 10% chance or 10-year event is a rainfall event that has a 10% chance of occurring in any given year. A 50% or 2-year event has a 50% chance of occurring in any given year. And a 0.2 annual chance event or a 500-year event follows the same nomenclature. I think it is important to remind you that the precipitation depths for each of these specified frequencies are based on statistical data, and they are not related to each other. For instance, a 100-year storm does not have 10 times the rainfall of a 10-year storm. I would also like to go over some flooding terms. A subwatershed is a subset of the larger watershed. We refer to areas that drain from a tributary into the main channel as a subwatershed. Clawson Ditch is a subwatershed of the larger Cedar Bayou watershed. Inundation mapping is used to identify the rising and spreading of water from the channel banks over the nearby ground, for example, stream flooding. This is not necessarily the same thing as a FEMA regulatory floodplain, which is based on inundation mapping, but also goes through a rigorous review and public input process to become a regulatory product for flood insurance purposes. You also hear the term system capacity. System capacity refers to the flow carrying capacity or how much water can move through a channel. For example, a system capacity of 100-year would mean the channel has the capacity to carry a 100-year storm event before it overflows its channel banks and begins to affect nearby structures. I want to reiterate that this project uses inundation mapping to identify current flood risk and to gauge the effectiveness of the flood reduction project. Now that we have clarified some of the terms, let's talk about the existing drainage patterns in the subwatershed. As part of the PER, we performed a detailed evaluation of the existing drainage conditions in the Clawson Ditch subwatershed. Our investigation revealed several existing drainage issues, such as a shallow depth and narrow width in the Clawson Ditch channel, which gives this channel very little capacity and limits the ability for outlying areas to drain. There are low-lying areas to the south and west of Clawson Ditch that are prone to flooding due to the elevations in the terrain. Flow restrictions at the FM 1942 bridge crossing result in overflows along the south bank of the channel that drain into low-lying areas southwest of FM 1942. The Flood Control District has several flood risk reduction tools at its disposal that can reduce flood damage throughout any given watershed. Tonight, we are focused on the following flood reduction strategies within the toolbox: channel conveyance improvements, road crossing improvements, and stormwater detention basins. When analyzing these flood risk reduction strategies, we looked at providing improvements ranging in system capacity from the 20% or 5-year annual chance storm event to the 4% or 25-year annual chance storm event. We'll now discuss each of these tools in more detail as they pertain to developing flood risk reduction within the Clawson Ditch project area. The first flood risk reduction tool I want to discuss tonight is utilizing channel modifications within a watershed. Channel modifications increase the size of channel so it can carry more stormwater, or in other words, increase the system capacity. There are different ways to increase a channel's conveyance capacity, which includes widening or deepening the channel, reducing the friction by removing heavily vegetated areas, or occasionally adding concrete lining. The team looked at a variety of channel modifications aimed at improving the flow capacity within Clawson Ditch and increasing the flow of stormwater away from areas prone to flooding. Road crossing improvements are another flood mitigation tool at our disposal. Oftentimes, support pillars of bridges or crossings, as well as the roads themselves, can restrict the flow of stormwater, which increases the risk of flooding upstream of the crossing. These improvements focus on replacing, raising, extending, or otherwise modifying crossings in order to remove restrictions to the flow of stormwater. As you may recall when discussing the existing conditions, flooding exists upstream of the FM 1942 bridge crossing. During this preliminary engineering stage, we explored how improving the road crossing would address these upstream areas. Stormwater detention basins are another structural flood mitigation method that create volume specifically for the purpose of collecting and holding stormwater during a storm event. We are utilizing stormwater detention in this project to mitigate the flow increases created by implementing channel improvements to Clawson Ditch. Without stormwater detention, the improvements would otherwise have potential to cause downstream flooding. For preliminary engineering, we looked at implementing stormwater detention basins in the lower, middle, and upper regions of the project area. Now I'd like to discuss in further detail how the Flood Control District incorporates detention basins in our projects throughout Harris County. A stormwater detention basin is built to store excess stormwater until it can make its way safely back into the channel and then ultimately out to Galveston Bay. There are several ways for stormwater to fill a detention basin, but it's important to note that all of our structures are passive designs that utilize gravity to operate them, so no mechanical gates or pumps are needed. This illustration shows stormwater overflowing into a basin from a bayou by the way of a weir structure. The weir serves as a designated location where stormwater rising in the channel can spill into the detention basin. As the water levels in the bayou recede, the stormwater from the basin drains by gravity through the outfall pipe and back into the channel. Stormwater detention basins are specifically designed using an offline or inline configuration to receive and temporarily hold large amounts of water. In the previous slide, I shared an example of an offline detention basin. With offline detention basins, the basin temporarily holds stormwater outside of the existing channel. When used for regional flood damage reduction projects, offline detention basins are typically located adjacent to the drainage channel. As the channel water elevation rises, the offline detention basin will receive stormwater through an engineered structure and hold the stormwater until it's safe to discharge back into the channel. For inline detention basins, the basin is open to the drainage channel. As the channel's water elevation rises, stormwater overflows into the basin. Inline detention basins are designed by either oversizing the channel and or using the control structure to elevate the channel water surface to spill into the detention basin. As the water elevations in the channel recede, the stormwater from the basin safely drains into the downstream channel. The Flood Control District typically constructs two types of stormwater detention basins. The red arrow to the right of the image points to an example of a wet bottom basin. A wet bottom basin typically has a permanent pool of water They can provide habitat for a variety of wildlife, as well as a stormwater quality improvement feature. Sometimes we are asked, how can a basin full of water hold more water? The answer is that the basin is not full. The space for storing stormwater is above the natural water table, up to the top of the basin's banks. The blue arrow to the left of the image points to an example of a dry bottom basin. A dry bottom basin will fill during a heavy rain event and then completely drain out once the storm has passed. Because it is dry most of the time, it provides the opportunity for adding trees or for recreational amenities to be built in and around the basin by others. Both wet and dry bottom basins fill up during heavy rain events and then drain as the receiving channel recedes. The difference is that one has a permanent pool and one has a dry and grassy bottom. Details of the Clawson Ditch Basin will depend on a variety of factors, including the exact property to be included, the presence of protected wetlands, and others. Since we just touched on stormwater detention, I want to give you an idea of how much detention is planned for the area. A standard football field is just about 1 acre in size. Now think of that football field covered with 1 foot of standing water. That volume of water is about 1 acre foot. The Clawson Ditch project requires approximately 170 total acre feet of detention. That is enough water to cover 170 football fields with 1 foot of water. Of course, these acre feet of stormwater will be stacked on top of another across the basin footprint, meaning that we do not need a basin layout that is 170 football fields large. The team looked at a variety of potential flood reduction options, which included a combination of channel modifications, road crossing improvements, and stormwater detention when exploring ways to reduce flood risk within this watershed. Based on the analysis of flood reduction performance and other considerations, the recommended improvements include channel modifications along Clawson Ditch to increase stormwater conveyance throughout the watershed, and providing approximately 170 acre feet of detention to temporarily hold stormwater during rain events. More project details will be available at the completion of the preliminary engineering report and will be accessible to you through the project website. We'll be reviewing the project schedule and project website location later in our conversation this evening. By implementing these proposed flood risk reduction strategies, this project will provide the following benefits during a 1% annual chance event or 100-year rain event. It removes inundation from up to 7 structures. It removes inundation from up to 66 acres of land, and it removes inundation from approximately 0.2 miles of roadway. In addition, this project will reduce the flow of stormwater entering the Cedar Bayou main stem during rain events, helping to reduce the flood risk downstream. The last thing I would like to touch on are the next steps. Where do we go from here? We are currently in the preliminary engineering stage and finalizing the PER. In the near term, the PER will be completed and approved by the Harris County Commissioners Court. We anticipate the PER will be completed this fall. Upon completion of the PER, our team will begin initiating the required right-of-way acquisition. Once these activities are initiated, the Flood Control District will host an early design community engagement meeting to share the details of the proposed project. The final design stage includes the development of detailed construction drawings and specifications that will be used to construct this project. We currently anticipate the design stage to be completed in the winter of 2023. Once final design is completed, the team will initiate the environmental permitting with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that will be necessary to meet regulatory requirements. Once permits are obtained, construction of this project can begin. At this time, we anticipate construction to begin in the fall of 2024. With that, I would like to send it back to Robert to close out the presentation and take us into the question and answers portion of the meeting. Robert?
Thank you, Andrew. Before we move into the Q&A, I want to share a quick reminder that we'd love to hear from you on this and other projects moving forward across Harris County. To learn more about this project, ask questions, and sign up for our mailing list, please visit hcfcd.org/F41. As a reminder, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. Submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. Submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F41, or submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 4758. If you are joining us via phone tonight, please press *3 to leave a message. Additionally, I want to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. Information from this meeting and a recording of the live stream will be available on the Flood Control District's website and YouTube channel. Joining Angie Moore for our Q&A session tonight are Gary Besmick, Manager of Feasibility Studies, and Shin He, Feasibility Studies Project Manager, who are overseeing efforts on these projects. Now it's time to take some of your questions. All right, our first question of the evening is for Shin. What is the Cedar Bayou Flood Risk Reduction Study?
Hello, good evening. Thanks for the question. So the Cedar Bayou Flood Risk Reduction Study, what we referred as FRRS, it is a planning level study that was conducted and completed in 2018. So that study we looked at the existing flood risk throughout the whole watershed, the Cedar Bayou watersheds, and we'll collect some data. We look like the drainage boundary, and we looked the channel conditions, and we come up with a high-level flood reduction concepts for the whole main stem, and also including the 18 tributaries, which including the Quonset ditch, what were our focus projects here today.
All right, thank you, Shin. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, what are the goals and objectives of the channel conveyance improvements for Quonset Ditch project?
Yes, as Shin mentioned, in 2018, the Cedar Bayou Flood Risk Reduction Study was completed. And that study was basically the feasibility or planning study that looked at the entire Cedar Bayou watershed to determine where flooding problems were and the severity of those problems, and to come up with recommendations on future studies. So when that study was completed, the Quonset Ditch or Q122 channel was identified out of that study as an area that within Cedar Bayou that needed a study. And since the planning study was complete and it had some general ideas on improvements, that study went to the PER process. So the overall goal of this channel conveyance improvements for Quonset Ditch project was to analyze different flood risk reduction alternatives and to provide a recommended drainage improvement project within the subwatershed. And when I say a recommended drainage improvement project, what we're talking about is to look at various alternatives that provide flood damage benefits, and then to recommend one that will move forward into ultimately, hopefully, construction. And so we go from this funnel of looking at the entire watershed to then focusing on a specific subwatershed. In this case, it's Quonset Ditch. And then ultimately we try to come up with a project that we can define well enough that we can send it forward to construction. So as part of this preliminary engineering investigation, the team looked at a variety of mitigation measures to reduce flood risk along Quonset Ditch. Some of the mitigation measures that were looked at include channel modifications, as were discussed in this project, as well as improving the FM 1942 bridge crossing. And then finally, in order to ensure that anything that we design does not move flooding from one area to another, we had to consider providing stormwater detention basins at various locations to make sure that, our project, whatever is recommended, would not result in downstream impacts.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Andrew. Andrew, how was this project determined?
Thank you, Robert. So like Gary and Shin mentioned, this project really came from the 2018 flood risk reduction study that was completed by the Flood Control District. Out of that study, there were several identifications of where there are current flood risks and potential projects that would help reduce that flood risk. So this study, Clawson Ditch, was one watershed where there were drainage improvements proposed that would provide flood risk reduction for the community here in this subwatershed. Out of that study, there were 9 projects in Cedar Bayou that were targeted, and Clawson Ditch was one of those that actually became part of the 2018 bond program. So that it started as a high-level study in the flood risk reduction study, became part of the 2018 bond program, and is now being studied in the PER, and will eventually move into design and construction.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And as a reminder, if you would like to submit a comment or question for tonight's meeting, you can submit a comment in the box near the presentation live stream. You can also submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/F41. And you can submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 4758. And if you're joining us via phone tonight, please press *3 to leave a message. All right, carrying on. Our next question is also for Andrew. Andrew, will there be any property buyouts or land acquisitions as part of this project?
Thanks, Robert. So right now we're a little too early to know what right-of-way is needed and where it is going to be needed for this entire project. As the time and the preliminary engineering report is completed, we will be reaching out to property owners for any of the right-of-way that we do determine is needed for this project. Right-of-way could be needed for the detention we've discussed, and actually acquiring that and developing and constructing the detention pond, as well as any channel improvements that are outside the existing flood control right-of-way and easement. But as we move through that process, we'll be providing information that's needed, showing the extent of the right-of-way, coordinating with the local property owners as soon as that process has been finalized and we're ready to move into that phase of the project. So right now, we're just a little too early to establish all those limits and where exactly we will be needing additional land to construct the Clawson Ditch project.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Our next question for this evening is for Gary. Gary, can you provide us with specific details of the projects that you will be implementing in Clawson Ditch?
Yes, thank you for the question. At the moment, the Flood Control District is analyzing the data gathered in the preliminary engineering stage. We're working to identify various projects that, when put together, will reduce flooding throughout the Clawson Ditch area. And we're trying to balance, those projects by looking at the benefits and the costs of a number of different alternatives. We are specifically looking at channel conveyance improvements and stormwater detention, because those were kind of the key anchor type projects, things that were identified in the previous study. However, at this time, we do not have a completed project analysis that is going to be able to say what the specific project components will be. Nonetheless, our goal is to provide you all with an update once we're able to iron out the details. So basically what we've done, I want to reiterate this from before, is we started with a feasibility study that looked at the entire watershed. In that study, we were trying to identify where within Cedar Bayou, the entirety of Cedar Bayou, do we have areas where the channel conveyance, the existing conditions, the channel is not able to convey flow, and that we have a history of flooding. So once we went through that feasibility study and we identified projects, those particular areas were put onto the 2018 bond. And then we're starting the process of working through those projects. So the preliminary engineering process is a little bit similar to the feasibility study process in that we start out by saying, we're focused on the Clawson Ditch Q122 area, but we're trying to identify in detail how we could implement project components within that sub-watershed. So instead of just looking at a channel, we start to look at specifics of how that channel crosses bridges, where there might be restrictions and right-of-way, where there might be environmental impacts if we were to channelize, and also looking at utilities, pipelines, and other restrictions. So the preliminary engineering phase really starts to get into a lot more detail so that we can identify specifically what we need to do with these projects and if there's anything we want to avoid. And so as we work through that, we start to refine the concept of channel modifications. And then we start to come in with specifics to say, okay, from this bridge to this bridge or this area to this area, this is what the channel would look like. But we may have to do some little changes in this area because there's an environmental constraint that we're trying to avoid, or there's a pipeline that we're trying to avoid. So all that detail gets put into this study. And at the end of it, we'll have an alternative that is very detailed, and it's really kind of along the ways it's ready for us to be able to start taking that into the design process. Ultimately, the goal is to get to construction. And so as we get to a stoppage point, and we have these alternatives very well defined, we will come back and do another meeting and give you all an update on what specifically we're trying to accomplish. And a lot of the questions about will there be land acquisition and those type of things, at that point, we'll have a very detailed answer for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Andrew. Andrew, when will the recommended alternative be chosen?
Thank you, Robert. So like Gary has mentioned, right now we're in the preliminary engineering report phase. So in this phase, we are looking at existing conditions and understanding what are the existing flood risk and what are the causes of those flood risks to the area. And then looking at weighing in the hydraulic benefits of different alternatives, such as stormwater detention, channel projects, or a combination of those to ultimately achieve our project goal. So during this phase, we're looking at different alternatives, either one of these or combining these into one option, and then weighing in all the different factors that could influence the project, such as on the utilities in the area, where can we actually require or acquire right-of-way, and depths of the channel and environmental considerations. So we're looking at different alternatives. We're weighing all the potential factors and impacts of the project, as well as the benefits of each of these alternatives that we look at, and then ultimately recommending one project for implementation. So right now we're in that phase, looking at all these options and weighing the impacts and benefits. And we're anticipating to complete the PER this fall. And so once we're done with that, our team will start looking at the right-of-way acquisition phase, contacting property owners as needed. And once these activities are initiated, we'll host an early design community engagement meeting, as Gary mentioned. And that's going to happen this winter or spring of 2023. And that's going to share the details of this recommended project. So we'll show sizes, locations, and the full benefit of the recommended project. So then the final design stage includes the development of the construction drawings and specifications that are going to be used to actually construct the project. And so we anticipate the design stage is going to be completed in the winter of 2023, with construction following that in 2024. And that's what's shown here is the overall project life cycle. So we're there in the blue in the preliminary engineering phase. And then after that, we'll be moving into the right-of-way phase.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is for Shen. Shen, what are the benefits of this project, and what is the purpose of this project?
Thanks for the question. So as my coworkers mentioned, the current stage for this project is under PER, which is we are wrapping up that analysis to figure out the final recommendation and also finalize all the details for the benefits. So we don't have that specific information available until we finalize the PER, but I can state a little bit, what kind of benefits we're looking at. For example, we're looking at the floodplains area. If we improve or do the channel improvements and detention basin, how much in floodplains reductions we can provide. So we're shrinking the floodplains in the area. And also we're looking at the number of homes that will be reduced from the floodplains. Like we have analysis based on homes elevations and comparing what's the proposed condition, what we call the floodplains level will be, and then we can lay out the maps and see how many homes will benefit from that. And also another metrics we are measuring is the roads and the miles of roads will reduce from the floodplains. So there are many factors, as Andrew mentioned earlier, where that's the metrics we're putting that into the considerations among all the alternatives, and we will select the most feasible for this area. And as we're moving forward, finalize the PER, we will have that more details data available. And the overall and always the purpose of the projects, what we're doing is trying to reduce the floodplains and flooding along the Clawson Ditch for the area. Thanks for the question.
All right, thank you, Shen. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, Josue asks, what is system capacity?
Yes. Probably takes a little bit of a holistic look at a watershed, but when we talk about a system capacity, typically we're talking about a channel system capacity. And so a channel system capacity is basically when we analyze a open channel, any particular bayou, how that channel can convey flows is sort of a function of two factors. One is how big is the channel itself? And then two, are there any restrictions such as bridges, pipelines, or just areas where naturally there's something that restricts the flow? So when, as planners at the flood control district, we are always trying to keep information countywide about what is the capacity of a channel system. And so we do that. The way we analyze that is we look at earlier in the presentation, we talked about a little bit about the various different flood frequencies. And so when we talk about a 100-year rainfall event or flood event, by design, there is a specific amount of rainfall, a rainfall pattern that we use to associate to the 100-year. When we say a 10-year rainfall event, there's a certain amount of rainfall and a pattern that we use to be able to analyze, what would happen if that amount of rain were to fall in this particular case in the Clawson Ditch area. And so when we talk about a channel capacity, we're looking at how much flow, if you got so much rainfall, how much rainfall once it gets into the channel, how much can that channel carry? So when we say a channel capacity, if a channel has a 10-year capacity, then we'd say that if a 10-year rainfall event occurred and all the water was able to get to the channel, that channel would be able to carry it. When we start to talk about the system capacity, that's where we have to create computer models and we have to simulate all the bridges, the pipelines, and anything else that we as engineers feel like would be a restriction, so that while the channel itself may be able to carry a 10-year in a hypothetical example, if the bridges were constructed years ago and they're too small or they're not elevated enough, it's possible that the channel itself may be able to handle a 10-year, so it has a 10-year channel capacity. But because the bridges or pipelines are crossing it, that channel may only be able, for a system capacity, be able to handle a 2-year event. So the terminology, channel capacity, system capacity, are just various ways that we try to analyze so that we can look at an area and we can get a pretty good feel for what do we need to do if we wanted to improve this. If the area has a very high channel capacity, but the system capacity is low, that typically means we're going to have to really look at redoing bridges or pipelines being relocated to allow for flow. But if the channel capacity is very low, then typically we're looking at channel modifications. And we talked about that in the presentation, making the channel bigger, deeper, wider, and or maybe concrete lining it. All of those are methods that would allow for that channel to handle more flow. So once again, channel capacity really is a metric that, or a terminology we use to look at the channel network. But when you start bringing the bridges, pipelines, and any other utilities, we start to call that a system capacity. And it's really just a measure for us to be able to say, how much can this channel or system handle in terms of rainfall? And then when we start to prioritize channels throughout the county, it's just good information to be able to say, okay, these channels over here have a 100-year, but these have a 5-year. And the 5-year would be something we'd want to do before the 100-year. And it just helps us with our analysis.
Okay, thank you, Gary. This next question is also for you. This question was submitted by Charlie. Charlie asks, will Cedar Bayou be cleaned out for better water flow?
Yes, the answer to that is, for the team that's here today presenting, we're on the capital improvement side of the flood control district. So in a sense, from an engineering perspective, there's kind of two sides that the district does. One is we go through the project life cycle to develop projects. And then once a project is built, it goes over to our maintenance side. So our maintenance team are responsible to maintain all of the open channel networks throughout the county. And our side, on the capital side or engineering side, is to design projects that provide flood control benefits so that the channels can handle more flow. There's less flow that's going to flood areas or flood homes. We have a maintenance team, and we basically will inspect the channels on an annual basis to look for cleanouts or erosion problems or anything that they identify that needs to be cleaned out or maintained. Now, if you, as a resident in a particular area, see something, you can go to our website, and I don't recollect the phone number, but we can probably post that later. But you can go to our website at hcfcd.org and type in service request. And when you get to that web page, it'll tell you that if you would prefer to call in, you can call in number, or you can type in a service request. So when we receive those service requests, our maintenance team will send a property manager out, and they will go out to wherever it is that the service request directs them. And they'll take a look at that area and make a determination if that's something that we need to do or can do. One of the things our property managers have to identify first is, do we have property rights for wherever this particular service request was sent? In some areas, some of the bayous are privately owned, or they're owned, outside of flood control's right of way. And we can only do work where we own right of way. So if it's something that they identify that we want to do, we'll probably have to go obtain property rights or permissions to get into the channel. And they make all those determinations. They will then respond back to you if you provided that service request. And then the process becomes that they put that into the next package. And then at some point when that project's priority elevates to the top, it'll get out and be done. So the general answer is, we are not, as part of this project, trying to identify areas within Cedar Bayou that need to be cleaned out. But again, our maintenance infrastructure side, that's something they do regularly. And if you all are aware of anything that needs to be cleaned out, I would encourage you to reach out to the district and either do a service request or just do a call in to give us that information, and then we can have our property managers get out and take a look at it.
Okay, thank you, Gary. During tonight's session, we received a very specific question about a single individual's property in particular. We just wanted to let this individual know that we will reach out to the property owner after the meeting, and the flood control district can then address their concerns or questions regarding that specific property in particular. Continuing with questions, continuing with Q&A. Gary, this next question is also for you. Charlie asks again, with all of the new housing construction on Garth and North Main, there is a lot more runoff now. Will this help resolve this issue as well?
Yeah, well, the new development has a lot of restrictions and requirements that they need to do when the development is being proposed. And so one of the things that's required is that, just like we talked about earlier, that when we design a project, we cannot increase flooding from one place to another. We cannot put in a channel improvement or modification and carry flow and cause another area to flood. So as new developments come in, whoever the permit authority is, typically it's within, if it's within a city, it's going to be that city. And if it's in an unincorporated part of Harris County, it would be Harris County permits. But when a developer is interested in building, now we're talking about more of a development. If somebody went out and just built, their own home, there's a whole different set of criteria. But for new housing construction, typically the developer is going to go and hire an engineer, and that engineer will do a drainage analysis. And as part of that analysis, they have to look at how much impervious area are they going to put in? Are they regrading the area that they're developing? And once all that's done, how much more water will be running off than maybe ran off before? And if they've increased the runoff, then they have to design a detention facility and keep that runoff within their own private property, take it to their detention, and then outfall at the same rates that were done before. So our project is not intended, that we talked about here, we're not intending it to offset any future development, because our assumptions are that as development comes in, they will mitigate with their own detention plans. But where we find restrictions in the channel or things that need to be improved, our project will, if we're going to take those restrictions out, our project will include the conveyance necessary to convey whatever it is we're trying to do, and then it will have mitigation detention basins in place to make sure that anything we've done will not create any downstream impacts.
All right, thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Andrew. Andrew, who is responsible for cleaning dirt off of the roads when excavation is underway?
Thanks, Robert. So as you can imagine, when there's large detention being constructed or the channels being widened, there's going to be a lot of excavation going on. There's going to be dump trucks coming in. There's going to be excavators taking that and putting it into the dump trucks, and there's going to be hauling it off to other places. So there's going to be a lot of dirt moving during construction of the project. And so during design, an engineer will develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, which will locate, fencing at certain areas and access points to the construction site, so that the dirt is contained as best as possible within the site. And so there's not, just dirt everywhere during a project. But ultimately, it's the responsible of the contractor, and they have a contract with the flood control district that they have to agree upon. That's going to use practices to keep dirt on the construction site and keep it from impacting nearby roads, which will help prevent impacts to stormwater quality as well as impacts to the actual roadway. As Gary mentioned, there's a website, www.hcfcde.org. And there's also a phone number on that website you can use to report any issues during construction to the Flood Control District Service Request Center. And so if you're seeing excessive roadway dirt or excavation materials that are during construction that are caused by a flood control project, you can reach out and report that issue, and the flood control district will work diligently to take care of it as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Our next question is for Shin. Shin, can a recreational amenity on flood control district land be private or accessible only to certain residents? And what if the recreational amenities are funded by the homeowners association?
Thanks for the question. So flood control district property is public owned. That means we cannot be restricted for use by only certain members of the public. It's for everyone. Even though a certain group like HOA will pay or fund some recreational amenities such as trails or exercise facilities, a bench, that is no different than the public beachfront property in Texas. You know, it should be open for everyone and it cannot be restricted only for that neighborhood.
Okay, thank you, Shin. Our last question of the evening is for Gary. Gary, what are offline detention basins and how do they work?
Yes, I think we had some information earlier in the presentation. Yep, here's the slide. When we're designing a detention basin, you know, there's a couple of options that we can do, and we do offline or inline for various reasons. But an inline, I'll start with that and then I'll circle back to the question at hand, what's an offline? But an inline is basically where the detention volume is within the channel. And so it's generally going to take the shape of a widened section along the channel that at the downstream end of that widened section, either the channel necks down and restricts or there's some kind of a control structure. And so as it rains and that area fills up, the downstream restrictor will kick in and water levels will just basically elevate and you get additional storage within the channel itself. Now, typically an inline basin, when it rains, when you get a small amount of rain, the volume is going to start to fill up because it's within the channel section itself. Now, an offline basin is often designed where we're trying to say, like, for example, hypothetically, if we had a channel that had, let's say a channel can handle 10 inches of rain. If you get 10 inches of rain, it's well within the channel banks and it flows through and there's no problem. But let's say we're doing a project and we're targeting 14 inches of rain. And we're saying when we get 14 inches, this area is, the channel's going to spill out and homes may potentially be at risk or roads will flood. And so in the case of an offline, we might say we don't really want the basin to start filling up when you get 5 or 6 inches because the channel itself can handle that. So the offline basin is designed so that when the channel starts to get to the top of bank, water can spill out of the channel into an offline basin that's situated near the channel. And that way we can target a specific amount of rainfall before that basin, you know, the channel starts to spill over. So again, an inline is the detention volume is within the channel. It's typically going to fill up as you get any small rainfall events. An offline basin would be a basin that if you've ever seen one, it's possible you'll get a small rain and you'll see that the basin is generally empty. And it doesn't really activate until you get to a certain target elevation. And generally speaking, an offline basin can do a lot of good and it can do it on a smaller area because we can target that not until you get above a certain elevation in the channel will that water start to spill. And so therefore, when it's below that, we don't have to worry about it. The basin has volume in it. And then once it gets to that design target, the water spills offline, goes into a separate facility. And then that facility will have a pipe or some structure that will allow the water to drain back into the channel once the channel banks start to go back down. So that's the difference between the inline and offline basins.
All right, thank you, Gary. And with that, I would like to share one final reminder that we are continuing to accept comments and feedback on this project through Thursday, July 21st. We also encourage everyone to get flood insurance as flood season in Harris County runs year-round. Thank you again for joining us this evening and for your engagement with this project. We look forward to continuing to share updates as our work moves forward. Thank you and have a good evening.